Of the many books that I've read over the past 18 months, there are four that stand out as critically important to individuals and society as a whole. They are Metabolical by Dr. Robert Lustig, Feeding Our Children by Dr. Thomas Flass, Eating to Extinction by Dan Saladino, and the one written by my guests on this program that you're listening to, some of you are watching, Great Taste, 60 minutes of what we always say is delicious radio, also informative radio. The book is called What Your Food Ate, and it's written by David Montgomery and Anne Biklé. I want to read their biographies because I think are a little bit about their who they are, because I think it's just better to take it straight from the publicists. David R. Montgomery is a MacArthur Fellow and Professor of Geomorphology at the University of Washington. He is internationally recognized. He is an internationally recognized geologist who studies the effects of geological processes on ecological systems and human societies. His work has been featured in documentary films, network and cable news, TV and radio, including Nova, PBS NewsHour, Fox and Friends, and All Things Considered. Anne Biklé is a science writer and public speaker. Her training is in biology and environmental planning, and her writing focuses on the connection between people, plants, food, health, and the environment. She has been known to coax garden plants into rambunctious growth and nurse them back from the edge of death with her regenerative gardening practices. Her work has appeared in digital and print magazines, newspapers, and radio, and her gardening practices have been featured in independent and documentary films, and I must say, could be used in our own personal land, if it was possible, if you didn't live in Washington. Anyway, welcome to the show.
Good.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So happy to have both of you here, and so happy to talk with you. Some of the statements that I'm going to mention right now, some of the phrases come directly from your book, and some of them are just things that I've added. But you write, both of you, that most of the world's farmland is sick, and so are we. We traded away quality for quantity in our farming practices. We confuse crop growth and yield with crop health. And one of the problems, you say, is that we aren't asking the right questions. We as the public, we as consumers, we as government, we as farmers, we as journalists. And some of the questions that I would like to just throw out at the beginning, for example, are soil health, farming practices, and human health all dependent on each other? Is it true that without chemical fertilizers and pesticides, we would all starve? Or is it that the use of fertilizers and pesticides creates a vicious cycle? The more you use, the more you have to use. If meta-analyses show organic practices result in more profits, same yields over time, less pesticide residue, and more diverse nutrient components, then why does our agricultural system not reflect that scientific conclusion? And what if we combined, as you suggest, ancient wisdom with modern science and increased soil biology? Is the answer to recreating our entire agricultural system and the way we look at it as simple as ditching the plow, creating a diversity of plant life, and keeping the ground covered? Now, that's a lot to throw out to you at the very beginning of our discussion, but I want to spring from there, if you don't mind, and I'd love for you to just give us a picture of what's going on in a healthy soil as opposed to an unhealthy soil environment.
Yeah, well, I think my mind is still buzzing with everything that you read. And
Anne, I'm going to just apologize, because that is a total error by a journalist, because you only ask one question. That's it. You don't ask 2, 3, 4, 5. So I apologize to both of you. Now go for it.
Yeah, no, it's really good. And what it makes me think of is I'm going to try and kind of just briefly consolidate all of that.
Okay.
As a way of saying that everything you just read is a reflection, I think, of pretty much, the main takeaway for us on this book. And just said as simply as possible, it's this: farming matters. It matters immensely to the health of the land. And people, human beings, animals, and plants come from the land. We are of the land. And that is why how we farm and why we farm is so important to our own health and well being. And a lot of the details and mechanisms of that, they're happening out of sight, below our feet in the soil. And that is in part why it has been so hard for, I think, consumers, farmers, government to adjust things and subsidize things and do things that are truly supporting this underground world that is sort of the linchpin to the above ground world, us and our busy lives um, and how we're sort of approaching the big problem of feeding everybody on this planet. So that's what all of what you just said kind of, makes me reflect on in what we wrote in What Your Food Ate. And I'm sure Dave has more to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the fun part about writing a book like What Your Food Ate was sort of digging into the scientific literature. And yes, that can be fun, to look back at what we've learned over the last 80 years, really sort of since the framing of what we now call conventional agriculture. We've learned an awful lot about what's going on in the soil and the relationship between soil life and plants and the health of the soil, the health of plants, the health of livestock, and the health of people, the sort of the framing that we use throughout the book to walk through that science. And when you get to the end, it's really looks like it's time to rethink some of the basic aspects of how we've been farming, in because it can actually help us in terms of reducing pollution. It could help with farm productivity and profitability. It could help put some carbon in the ground that will be a contributor towards helping to mitigate climate change, and it can reinstill our foods um, with elements and chemicals that are actually beneficial to us as as a consequence of changes of the way that we farm. And there's a lot of dots to connect there. If you're looking at connecting soil health to human health, we all know that what we eat matters to our health. We all know that whether we get any exercise matters to our health, and that our genes can influence our health.
Mhm.
But if you take the next step and look at, well, what else? Uh, I think one of the biggest overlooked things is how we've raised our food and what that means in terms of their provisioning of compounds that can help support our health and serve as preventive medicine, that is fairly missing, if you will, from our diets today.
Mhm. So I would be remiss because of not mentioning this to everyone, because it was part of the bio that I forgot to read, and that is that Anne and David are married and live in Seattle, Washington. Their work includes not only the book What Your Food Ate: How to Heal Our Land and Reclaim Our Health, a trilogy of books about soil health, microbiomes, and farming, Dirt: The Erosion of Civilizations, The Hidden Half of Nature, and Growing a Revolution. Now, speaking to what you were just saying, David, um, from your article that you both wrote, Soil Health and Nutrient Density Beyond Organic versus Conventional Farming, um, you write the two most compelling findings of previous studies are that conventional crops consistently have higher pesticide levels and organic crops have higher phytochemical levels, particularly antioxidants and anti-inflammatory compounds. Studies consistently show that organic and regenerative crops contain higher levels than conventional crops, and often several times more. And then to the point that you just made, all this points to the need to reframe nutritional and agricultural research and policy around the effects of farming practices on soil health, as simply basing comparisons on the organic versus conventional distinction can blur underlying differences due to the effects of farming systems on soil life. So this is maybe possibly an entry point, one entry point into this whole discussion, because maybe you could give us a little bit of insight into the three, I think, basic farming systems that you both talk about in the book: conventional, organic, and regenerative. And then what I'd like to do is to pick up on what you mentioned regarding where we've been for the last 80 to 100 years also after that.
Yeah, so well, maybe I'll start and may add on. But when we look at conventional farming, I mean that's what most farmers are doing today, which involves a fair amount of tillage, the liberal application of agrochemicals, synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, and pesticides, and a very limited suite of crops that are grown on most fields. Sometimes just a corn and soybeans rotation, a two-crop rotation, sometimes just adding another in there, but generally limited to things that are not very diverse. And that's what we might expect to be considered to be a conventional system. In terms of organic systems, those are ones where the use of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides are not allowed. There's other sort of strictures and sideboards on it, but you can kind of think of organic as a system as prescribing things that you're not allowed to do. And when we look at regenerative farming, it's, the arguments about what that word means in terms of a farming system are ongoing, and there's not like widespread agreement. But there was a journal article last year that reviewed how people have been using that term, and they came to the conclusion that, well, systems that are based on promoting building soil health is really what that's getting at. And I would agree with that. That's essentially how I tend to think of a regenerative practice or a regenerative farming system would be one that builds soil health as a consequence of intensive farming. And so that's not necessarily organic. It's not precluded from being conventional, but one that would focus on that. And so you could think of regenerative in the way I'd like to think of it as more of an umbrella term. So things like biodynamic farming, that's very much oriented towards the health of the soil. That would be in the regenerative camp. Organic farms that really take care of their soil and build healthy, fertile soil, they'd be regenerative. And I've even been on some conventional farms that have weaned themselves so that off of most fertilizers and agrochemicals to the point where they've rebuilt healthy, fertile soil. And they're not organic, but they're really pretty good about soil health as a consequence of virtually eliminating agrochemicals, although not completely. So in terms of those systems, that's how I tend to sort of think of them, and that has some blurry lines between them, right? That those aren't really crisp boundaries.
Mhm.
And in terms of what we mean with the spectrum of farming practices in both conventional and organic systems, um, there's a wide range of practices that are used in both the conventional farming systems and in organic farming systems. And within each of those systems of farming, certain elements of those practices are better or worse for the soil in terms of soil health. So I've been on organic farms with absolutely incredible soil health, and I've been on some organic farms that have very poor soil health. And one of the central theses of that, one of the first book that we wrote on soils, Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations, that you mentioned a minute ago, was looking at how societies in the past had degraded their land through farming practices in a fairly serious way, in ways that undermined the longevity of their civilizations. And some of those examples go back centuries to thousands of years, long before modern conventional agriculture evolved. And so they were de facto organic practices the way we'd look at them today. What was wrong? Well, they plowed too much and they degraded their land too much. And so organic farms that plow too much too often can limit the health of their soil. And conventional farms that wean themselves off of agrochemicals so they're minimizing the chemical disturbance of life in the soil can be pretty good for soil health. So when we think of soil health as sort of a different dimension, shall we say, through which to evaluate farming practices and how good they are for the land.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I would just have a couple of comments on that. I think so that's a nice crisp question that you had there. Let's talk about the three main systems of agriculture. And what I think we've both learned through sort of this journey into the trilogy of books, the Dirt trilogy and the latest one, is that none of these systems are these monolithic black and white kinds of things. Uh, and this makes it kind of hard to get at sometimes, we get questions a lot, well, which one is better? And an answer is, well, that depends, what are the actual practices? Because I think one of the most interesting things when you get out and you start talking with farmers, you start looking at farms, is you realize a number of things. Farming is hard. It's hard to figure out what works best given your resources, given your land these days, given the climate. And so I really see sort of these agricultural systems as being on this continuum. And at one end of this continuum, you have um, a lot of inputs that farmers are purchasing, and it could be anything from nitrogen fertilizer to patented seeds. And as you move along this continuum, you sort of, those things begin to drop out, and you begin relying more on ecology and biology. And by that, I mean um, things like cover crops, or things like, well, what is the, what's the capacity of my soil to hold water? Do I live, in drought stricken California, or do I live in, rain inundated Connecticut? How am I gonna manage those things? So it really is a continuum, and I think we sort of do a disservice to farmers and to agriculture as a whole when we try and pigeonhole farmers and farming systems. Now, it's very helpful to sort of slice things, into conventional, organic, and regenerative for good reasons, the whole USDA organic program and where that came from and what the hopes and dreams were for that and where it is now. But I also think it makes it seem like farming and agriculture is more cut and dried than it actually is. And so it's
Mhm.
important to just, I don't know, variability. One thing, just maybe one of the big takeaways for me with writing What Your Food Ate is just how variable the world is out there. Whether you're talking about, people often think, oh, agriculture, I mean, all these plants and animals are all domesticated. How could that possibly have anything, ecological or, really biological that we might tweak in these things? And the fact is there's still huge variability out there in the world of agriculture. And again, this is in part because of the physical external conditions that all these plants and animals are living in, just like us human beings. So
Yeah, and
yeah.
you can think about if we think about building soil health as sort of the what we would hope for as a priority in a sustainable agricultural system. And that boils down to building soil organic matter and supporting beneficial microbial life in the soil, cultivating the beneficial life in the soil. And there's two ways we can think about disturbing that life and degrading soil health. And one is chemical disturbance, and that's what conventional agriculture does in a pretty profound way. It alters the communities of life in the soil. Tillage disrupts microbial communities. It can be very destructive to what's going on beneath the surface of the soil. Um, but there's also physical disturbance, and that's where some organic farms can get into trouble if they don't have a lot of soil organic matter and they do a lot of tillage. They can essentially be limiting their potential to raise their soil health through that physical disturbance. And so I think that a goal of regenerative agriculture, the way I see it, would be to try and minimize both physical and chemical disturbance on a farm.
Okay. Now, for I think for most of us who aren't farmers and probably have very little agricultural experience except for maybe planting some tomatoes in the spring or some flowers, it seems almost counterintuitive from the little bit that we know that you would talk about moving around, essentially plowing the soil, as something that is disturbing. Because I think most of us anyway have grown up with the photos in our mind, visits maybe to farms, maybe to pick blackberries or to pick not to blueberries or strawberries, in the spring, or things like that. And it's just something that we would normally just see, this tilled soil. And yet what we're hearing and what I've read from you both is that this is something that is a critical element that needs to be essentially adjusted.
Right.
Yeah, that needs to be in effect minimized to the extent possible whether in conventional or organic systems. And so, it is kind of counterintuitive. We're all sort of, trained in a way from our upbringing to think about, oh, that's what farmers do. Like they plow. And there's a reason that they do. And they don't just do it for fun. They're doing it to suppress weeds, and it's a great way to suppress weeds. Just turn the soil over, bury the weeds. They don't do well underground because they're trying for the light. And it's there's also a misconception that it helps prepare the land for water to infiltrate, for rainfall to sink down into the soil. That turns out not to be actually correct. What happens with tillage is that if it pulverizes the superficial soil, it basically can create almost like a powder if it's tilled too often at the surface. And you can run the experiment yourself to sort of see what happens with a bag of flour and a paper bag that you put flour in, leave it out in the rain. What happens? You get a crust on top, and that water that you can still, the flour down below will be dry because that crust is stopping the water from sinking down into it. That's analogous to what can happen in an overly tilled soil that can crust over, that can cause runoff that would carry away your topsoil, carry away any fertilizer that's been added, maybe even carry away the seeds that have been planted. And so one of the big problems with tillage that I wrote about in Dirt was that it accelerates soil erosion over background erosion rates. Everywhere on Earth is eroding. It's either losing soil or receiving sediment. But the pace at which it happens really matters because soils are also rebuilt from breaking down rocks and integrating organic matter into it. And if soils erode faster than they're replaced, we're literally thinning them and running out of them. And that's happened to society after society around the world in ways that their descendants are still paying the price for now centuries later. So if we look at tillage as a disturbance process that can accelerate erosion, that can be bad, but it also accelerates the breakdown of soil organic matter. Why? It stimulates bacterial decomposition of organic matter. And that actually is a double-edged sword because what it means is that you can get a little burst of fertility. If you till, you can get a burst of fertility out of the land because it draws down some of the energetic batteries, if you will, of the organic matter in the soil, the carbon-rich compounds that were formerly living matter that can help fuel the growth of new life, and that can feed microbes in the soil. So if you basically get a burst of fertility from tillage, it can help this year's crop. But if you do it every year for 100 years or centuries, you can basically burn through the native fertility of the land. And there's a study that came out in Nature, I think it was in 1994, that looked at you can basically plow consistently fields in temperate zones for maybe half a century to a century before you really deplete the topsoil. But you can only do it for 5 to 10 years in the tropics. Those aren't very long time. When we think about sustainable farming, if it's under 100 years, that doesn't cut it no matter how you look at it. And so tillage has one of these double-edged swords where it helps us produce in the short term, but it undermines our ability to produce in the long term. Um, and so that's really where sort of the dangers of tillage come in. Now, it's not like nobody should ever till anywhere ever. If you've got a compacted, crusted soil that one pass through can break it up and help with that. If you have an organic farm, say, where you don't want to use any chemicals for weed control, if you have a lot of organic matter in the soil and you have sources of organic matter to replace it, a lot of compost and mulch, say you're near a city and you're able to use composted urban organic waste to rebuild your soil organic matter, then your farm could be very resilient to tillage, and you could till an organic farm without just degrading the soil over the long run. And that's where the argument for minimizing chemical and physical disturbance comes in. And what makes sense to do depends on the context of the farm. Are you trying to be? Are you an organic farm that has forsworn the use of chemicals? In which case, you might need to till every now and then. But then you want to have other ways to replenish the soil organic matter. And if you're on a conventional farm, there's both tillage and over application of nitrogen fertilizer has similar downsides to tillage in terms of stimulating microbial life to break down organic matter in ways that degrade fertility over the long run. And that, in effect, as I think you mentioned earlier in one of your initial barrage of questions, was if you use too much nitrogen fertilizer for too long and degrade your native soil organic matter, you become dependent on that fertilizer for maintaining your yields. And we like to call that the agrochemical treadmill. It's a form of dependency.
Right.
Yeah.
Anne, did you want to?
The only thing I would sort of say about plowing and tillage is that you're really absolutely spot on with the observation that all of us think when we see a plowed field or we see somebody in the actual plowing, and that could be a gardener, with the rototiller, or somebody out in Iowa with these, giant pieces of farm equipment. And it has an upside and it has a downside. And what I think we sort of failed to realize when it comes to tillage is that it does have this duality. And when you lose sight of that, I think that's where problems then start emerging for the health of the soil. Because, I mean, Dave's absolutely right. Where you want to be with farming and with growing food is in this sweet spot of, we have to disrupt the soil a little bit because we need to get seeds in the ground. We need to get on the ground and be tending to these crops and stuff, and be harvesting them. But you want to try and do that in ways that really minimize the downsides of tillage. And so that's where I think our very best, and it's not all, but our very best organic farmers, they really understand this. And so they are really, because they're more reliant on tillage, because they're not using chemicals to deal with weeds and pests and things like that. They really need to be on top of their organic matter so that they can, the diet of the soil, which is all of these microbes, all these bacteria, fungi, and other things. They're not getting enough organic matter. These Dave referred to it as, the batteries of the soil. Those batteries aren't getting recharged. But a lot, like I was saying, our very best organic farmers, they get this. They understand how important it is that if they are going to be plowing, which is the physical disruption side of things, they've got to be on top of the organic matter so that all of the sort of collateral damage that comes with plowing, they're right on the back end of that, coming in with, with the cure, with we're going to get you back up on your feet, and we're going to start this cycle all over again, microbes. Mm-hmm. So that's really, I think, kind of sort of the whole game there when it comes to understanding tillage, why it's good, why it's bad.
So now if we take that same type of dive into another input, chemicals, and how they in general disrupt the soil microbiome, can you give us just a brief idea of what those inputs do over time?
Yeah, I mean, the two that I think have been studied the most are synthetic nitrogen fertilizers and herbicides, and they both alter the communities of life in the soil. Not necessarily the amount of life in the soil. It's not like they'll necessarily sterilize it. Some fumigants can do that, but that's a whole different issue. But take nitrogen, for example. What it can do is it can alter the communities of bacteria and fungi in the soil, and it can greatly suppress what are known as the mycorrhizal fungi, which are fungi that partner with crops and deal with, can essentially mine mineral elements from the soil and trade it to crops for what the crops leak out of their roots or exude out of their roots, things like carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, food, in other words. And why would plants be taking anywhere from 30 to 40, sometimes even 50% of what they capture through photosynthesis and exuding it out of their roots to feed microbes in the soil? It's because they get stuff in return. It's an exchange. And the role many fungi play is in the acquisition of mineral micronutrients, things like zinc or copper that plants need for their health and defense, that we need in our diets for our health and defense as well. But that there may not be much in and around the root zone of a plant, and so fungi can serve as root extensions with their fungal hyphae extending off further into the soil, gathering particular elements. Phosphorus is another one that they'll gather, and they'll bring that and exchange it to plants. Now, what happens when you grow a plant in a very nitrogen-rich environment? Different gene pathways are activated in most plants and crops that basically curtail or shut down, not completely shut down, but greatly reduce the amount of exudates they produce. Why? Because nitrogen is sort of one of a key limiting element for crop growth, and if they're getting a lot of it, they tend to get lazy. I think having kind of couch potato crops, I think, is a term that we use in one of the books.
I can tell you exactly what you said, because it was one of my favorite lines in the book. If I can find it really quickly, it was definitely it had to do with couch potatoes, and it was darn. I hope I thought I had it here really easily accessible, but it looks like I don't. But that's exactly right. You said that they become couch potatoes essentially, in their uh, activity or lack thereof, we'll say,
Yeah.
activity.
So when they're growing in a very nitrogen-rich environment, which happens when you apply, a lot of soluble nitrogen fertilizer to a field, it's available to the plants. It's the whole point of fertilizing. Um, when they take up that fertilizer, they will stop investing so much and trying to recruit microbial partners. And so what they lose out on are a lot of those micronutrients, the things they don't need to stay alive, but that are actually central to their health and defense. And there's analogies when we get to sort of the human food supply, but that it's no, that leads to essentially undermining the natural healthcare system, if you will, the natural defense system of crops, which means that then, pests and pathogens have an easier time. And so it's probably no coincidence that the global use and reliance on pesticides went through the roof after we adopted, the global application of very large applications of nitrogen fertilizers in the Green Revolution to support the crops that were bred to perform well under the singular metric of high yield in nitrogen-rich environments. So there's a lot of science that's come through in the last 50, 80 years that has helped to explain how some of these connections work, and that's what we try and go through in the book to try and take it out of the realm of journals and translate it into language that normal people can understand.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, you said plants become botanical couch potatoes. Slackers, I love that use of that. Slackers from intake of synthetic fertilizers. That's a very strong, condemnation of these living organisms, that are actually, it's not from their own. They did it in response to something we did, actually, in terms of our inputs, right?
Right.
Yeah, they're just following the dictates of their own biology, and if we, those partnerships between life in the soil and crops or plants go back to the colonization of the continents by plants, some 450 million years ago, and there's a lot of very finely tuned, evolutionarily honed relationships between soil life and plants, of which that mineral provisioning, micronutrient provisioning is but one example.
Mhm. And these particular distinctions and amazing abilities that the soil and all of the components have, I think we want to get into, hopefully a little bit later, have such an impact on human health or lack thereof, and what we're seeing today. And you mentioned, David, this just a little while ago. You mentioned the past 80 years, and I noticed in the book there was a lot of attention paid to different individuals in England, or yes, in England, and the talk about different studies that were done there back in the 30s, actually, that had to do with the English diet and health problems that were occurring. And there were several people that were mentioned in relation to that. Um, Harrison, Howard, Eve Balfour, Jack Drummond. I wonder if you could give us just a little bit of a summary of the importance of that work.
Yeah, I think, to those who are organic farmers or follow organic farmers, two of those names at least, Eve Balfour and Sir Albert Howard, they probably have heard of those folks. And I don't think that either Balfour or Howard, were by any means, the first organic farmers, but they were, they are known for their, I guess, their realization and their work that they didn't necessarily call it soil health at the time, but what they both became aware of through sort of different avenues. Howard was in India working with the farmers who were growing tea for the Brits, basically. And he came out of what was basically sort of a traditional agricultural education at that time. And when he got to India, he was quite surprised at, right, they didn't have all these chemical inputs to grow tea. And these farmers were actually teaching him. So here it is, some of this indigenous traditional knowledge is boomeranging back to scientists and to farmers about, oh, look, this can work as well. And so what he had noticed was these particular composting methods were really effective in controlling pathogens and diseases from tea plantation to tea plantation. And he became very interested in that. And as it turns out, he was on to mycorrhizal fungi, positive effects of fungal rich soil. And Eve Balfour, she didn't travel. She didn't go to India. She realized many of these same things right on her farm in England. And she became so interested and curious about how all of this works. And we write quite a bit about this in one of the books. She set up an experiment, and this is the kind of work that we still really need. And that is to take a specific farm and be comparing different practices side by side, so that you're dealing with as much as you can control for environmental conditions, that you're growing things in the same kinds of soil, generally same rainfall and so on. So that was called the Hockley experiment. And what she unfortunately, that experiment ran into wartime difficulties, because Britain at that time, all the resources were going toward the war, including things like nitrogen. And so it messed up some of her experiments, and she and others who were doing all of this weren't able to complete everything. But basically what it all pointed to was what Howard was learning in India on the tea plantations, and that is that soil and the condition of soil and how farming affected soil was rippling through to crops and animals. And then that third person you mentioned, Jack Drummond, he had a really interesting observation, and that was that, kind of counterintuitively, the health of English people actually improved somewhat in the war years. And he attributed that to the English were eating, although they were eating a bit less calorically, they were also eating less processed foods. And they were eating, more whole plant and animal foods, probably, not as much on the animal product, and again, because of the impacts of the war. But this was also a really interesting observation that came out of, sort of these I guess our British cousins, so to speak. And just one last thing you didn't mention, but I think it's really kind of a sign of the times from back then, is that there was a group of doctors that were really following the findings of these farmers and agricultural researchers. And they convened a meeting called, I forget this is the Cheshire meeting, I think. And it resulted in these group of farmers and doctors coming together to talk about what each was seeing. Both the doctors were seeing, at this time, chronic illnesses on the rise, and the farmers are seeing a demise in their soil, and they're asking this question: are these things related? And they produced something called the Medical Testament, and it's all about this subject, and it's quite interesting. And I really think we're due for a 21st century meeting again of doctors and farmers and soil scientists to talk more about these linkages.
But what's frustrating from an observational standpoint in relation to what we're discussing is that a couple of years ago, the British government, set up a national food strategy recommendation process. And there was an individual who was in charge of it, who studied it for everything, and made a report to the government about recommendations that had to do with basically, essentially just going over the same type of information that Jack Drummond realized was the reason why people were healthier during World War II, and that you mentioned, Anne, eating more whole foods, for example, as one aspect of their diet. But the government's response to these recommendations in their white paper this spring indicated that we still have a long way to go, because they basically kind of, my interpretation is, well, yeah, all these things are pretty good, but and matter of fact, I think the two most important things, which had to do with sugar and salt, and then the recommendations related to those things and to chemical agriculture too, were just kind of put on the back burner. So I think that, when we talk about all these things, and this is also related to what we find in the chemical agriculture of the states, that's in the states, for example, is that unless we can economically present models that show why farmers should consider moving from conventional agriculture to organic or to regenerative or to a combination of all those. I think that's really the major sticking point in that sense, because economically it has to be viable. Now, you do point out in the book that economically it works. Organic agriculture, regenerative agriculture. I mean, I was amazed at some of the figures that were in the book. I think 1 acre yielding $100,000 in revenue generation from vegetable production. I mean, so I guess, I definitely want to return to some of the issues that plague our soil, but I think that right now economics is, I wonder how you can address that, or how you would address that.
Um, the positive economic benefit to the farm from adopting regenerative practices was one of the things that really turned me into an optimist on the issue of whether or not we could address the problem of large-scale agricultural soil degradation. And if you look at what are some of the big input costs on a modern farm, diesel, fertilizer, and pesticides are probably the top three. Those are the very three things that adopting regenerative practices can actually help you reduce. And some of the farmers that we have visited and interviewed who were early adopters of regenerative practices and who have really restored the health and fertility of their land, they have dramatically reduced the reliance on all three of those by 50 to 90% in some cases. And their yields are comparable to their conventional neighbors, which means that they're spending less to make as much. That's a recipe for more profitable farm. And we've seen, over the last 10 years in particular, we've seen growing interest in an adoption of regenerative practices from farming communities, because it is penciling out as a way. And when you see your neighbors, buying a new truck when you're going broke, you kind of go like, well, what's he doing that I'm not doing? And so that was something that really sort of made me turned me into more of an optimist on this. And then as we started digging into stuff for the new book, one of the things that there are papers out there that have documented is that organic agriculture is about one of the more profitable sectors in our agriculture today. Now, of course, some of that is due to the premium they can get for their produce, right? Because it tends to sell for a little bit more. In the U.S., we import a lot of organic produce because we don't grow enough to meet the demand. And so if we're not growing enough to meet demand, the prices are going to be a little higher than they might need to be. But the actual costs of production are not as high. If I recall the figures right, the differential in the cost of production may be just a few percent. It's not that huge, but that there's just not enough of it to go around to meet demand.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
yeah, and then your question was about the economics of things, and so Dave's just covered that end of things, at least for from a farmer's perspective, agricultural perspective. Something else that's kind of unique to this country is that we spend more than any other westernized developed country on our health care, and we have the worst health outcomes in terms of chronic diseases anyway. And what that's not that's just not a sane way to go about much of anything. And so I think the kind of Models can be very tricky because it all depends on the assumptions and the data that are used going into a model. But I think the model that we really sort of need to take a look at is, all right, if we were growing crops and raising animals in ways that put what I call the Fab Four back into these foods, and so these Fab Four, what are the farming practices that translate into higher levels of phytochemicals, higher levels of micronutrients, the healthiest balance of fats, and a whole array of microbial metabolites. Those are sort of the four areas of nutrition that we have linked in the book to farming practices. And those are also the very things that help our bodies fend off chronic diseases. They help our cells, tissues, and organ systems really function normally and like they're supposed to. But when they don't, that's then when we end up with chronic diseases, and then, you're in and out of uh, various interventions and treatments for, the last 2 to 3 to 4 decades of one's life.
Mhm.
And so, what if the model was, let's boost the things that we need to have in our food supply, and let's see how much it might reduce medical costs, and let's see what that does in terms of health outcomes. So instead of just looking at, like, economics in terms of for the farmer, let's look at farmer economics plus health economics, put the two together and use that to modify the kinds of ways government subsidizes various programs in agriculture and various programs in the health sector.
So back in the 1950s, in America, we spent twice as much on food as we did on healthcare.
Mhm.
And after, half a century of agricultural policies designed to provide an abundant supply of cheap, conventionally raised food, we now spend twice as much on healthcare as we do on food.
Mhm. And and when I've talked to physicians, like two that I mentioned, Dr. Thomas Flass and Dr. Robert Lustig, both of them I think would agree with the model that of all the disease that is plaguing us today in our society, and the amount of money that we're spending on healthcare, and the amount of money that's projected to be spent on healthcare over the next couple of decades, the reality is that 3 out of 4 of these metabolic health problems can be curtailed with lifestyle changes. And lifestyle changes also includes not just individual lifestyle changes like people having more activity, but people eating well, but also the changes that would need to occur to what our food eats in terms of the type of food that we end up getting. So I wonder if we could look at one particular input and kind of spring off of that many people are familiar with, because I wonder if it might be helpful for people to really understand the extent of what an input might do is in regards to the nutritional quality of not only the soil itself and the life in the soil, but also the product that comes out of that soil. So when you talk about asking the right questions, I'm going to speak about glyphosate. And I think you might mention this in the book, that many times the questions around glyphosate have to do with glyphosate and the crops that it's used on that are genetically modified. And so the debate goes all into genetic modification. Whereas, what about what you mentioned really, I think is the question, or not the question, but the actual circumstance, which is that we've been running an uncontrolled experiment on ourselves, because glyphosate and what it does, what it is and what it does is causing harm to not only the soil microbiome, but also our own gut microbiome, and therefore results in what you just mentioned regarding health costs spiraling.
Yeah. Glyphosate's an interesting example, and when you take a look at the history of this agrochemical product, it was originally patented as both an antibiotic, and so that means it's designed to kill life, In this case, typically antibiotics are for microorganisms, but it was also patented as a metal chelator. And so it was, so what is metal chelation? Well, one of the early applications um, was to clean out these pipes that have all of these metals encrusted on the pipe because you want to get, whatever it is you're pushing through that pipe with, less friction. So then, time passes and glyphosate becomes an herbicide. And I found to be one of the most interesting things about it was that David talked earlier about plant exudates. So these, again, just a quick refresher, these are all these compounds and molecules that a plant is fabricating, manufacturing in its own body. So these are, botanical products, truly. And they push them out in their roots. And this is what holds together the symbiosis between a plant and its microbiome. Well, turns out that glyphosate has been picked up in exudates as well. So a plant that's exposed to glyphosate is putting the glyphosate into its exudates. And I just have to tell you, generally these exudates are for feeding and keeping around all of these beneficial microorganisms. So all of a sudden, the plant has turned into sort of a distributor of a poison. And this is breaking apart the symbioses that it would otherwise be building and supporting. So we don't have a good enough understanding of everything that glyphosate does, but one thing that we know for sure because of all the research on microbiomes, whether it's in plants or people or whatever organism, is that when the microbiome gets scuttled, so that's just to say when it gets altered, somebody really at the center of the microbiome, an organism gets pushed out, a new organism comes in. We don't understand what all of those effects are. Generally, the more you scuttle and perturb a microbiome, though, the worse off the host is, whether that's a plant or a person. So that's problematic that glyphosate is found in the very things that plants are putting out in the soil to recruit beneficial microbes. And then as far as its effects on metal chelation, Dave's also talked about a lot of these micronutrients are metals: iron, copper, zinc. And a chelator prevents metals from moving around. So all of a sudden we're putting something in the soil that's interfering with the way, say, mycorrhizal fungi or other organisms in the soil are basically moving these minerals to the doorstep of a plant so that roots can take them up. What if they're like, a ship that's stranded off port, though, where there's, you can do soil tests. Wow, you've got no shortages in your iron or your zinc or copper. But then you're asking yourself, well, then how come none of it's inside of my crops? Well, because it's stranded outside the root system because the transporters, the miners, the truckers, the provisioners, they've been thrown off the job, or they're not around at all. So glyphosate's an interesting example because it's, in some cases, it's less about the direct toxicity and poisoning of things, and it's more about the crippling of absolutely fundamental processes that happen between crops and their soil microbiome.
Mm-hmm. And when you apply that to a question that you pose as to how much of a difference does healthy, fertile soil make to the nutritional quality of the food that we get out of it, can you give us some general conclusions regarding that?
Well, we did some very preliminary comparisons on regenerative and conventional farms across the country that had the regenerative farms had double the soil organic matter than their neighboring conventional farms, 3 times the soil health score. So it's sort of a comparison of lower quality soil health to higher quality soil health. And we found differences in terms of phytochemicals, phytosterols, phenolics, and carotenoids, if I'm remembering the 3 correctly. That were roughly 20 to 25% higher in the regenerative fields. Certain vitamins and minerals were higher as well. And there's some data that looks at how 100% grass-fed meat and dairy products have a better omega-3 fat profile and a better omega-6 to omega-3 fat ratio than conventionally feedlot raised beef. So there's studies that have looked at that, have started to look into that. So there appear to be real differences. Some of the comparisons we had much higher differences, but on average they were on that the order of what I was just saying. So it looks like that there are benefits to be had in terms of what's in our diets, but there's a lot of work that still needs to be done to look at, okay, for which practices and which crops and by how much, because there's the potential for really big differences in things like phytochemicals.
Mhm. Well, I'd really like to get into a discussion with you, and I hope that we'll have an opportunity in the future to focus on some of these other issues that you just brought up, Dave, in terms of, fats and dairy and what we see in regard to the results of conventional farming as opposed to organic and regenerative farming, and also looking more at just some of the solutions that we can all, be so that we can all be optimistic about our future. And I think that I'd love for each of you, if you'd like to just wrap things up with whatever thoughts that you might have. And to that end, I want to just mention that one of the statements that was in the book that a regenerative farmer made to you both, which I think is the essence of some of the messaging in the book itself, is that the farmers stated to you that when they look at what they're doing, they are looking at it from the standpoint that everything in nature is communicating. And so now I throw it back to you.
Yeah, that's our really amazing vegetable farmer in Connecticut, Brian O'Hara. And when to me, something that's so fascinating and why I love researching, writing, talking about this field is that it comes kind of right down to this: is that human beings have always been embedded in nature, for better and worse. Even in our modern times, we're still embedded in nature. And I think our agricultural systems, whether, conventional, organic, regenerative, call them what you want, they're still in us and a part of us. And that's part of why I'm both concerned but also hopeful in how we can continue to be agricultural societies, but also the opportunities to go forward so that the way that we farm, how we're affecting soil health, can begin to turn around the health of the planet and the health of, the human body writ large. And so when farming is good for the land, I think it's good for us too.
Dave?
And I'll just echo the last thing that Anne said, because that's actually, I think, one of the big sort of takeaways for me from the book was that if you dig into the science and the history of the last 100 years in particular, and what we've learned since the dawn of what we now call conventional agriculture, and you look at how farming practices affect soil health, and soil health affects crop health, and crop health affects animal health, and how the health of of crops and animals, what gets into them that then gets into our diet, affects our health. You know, you're left with that conclusion that what's good for the land is good for us too, and that's a fairly stark indictment of modern conventional agriculture when we look at it that way, because it's not that good for the land. So we're really at a crossroads, I think, in terms of thinking about agriculture, where, in Growing Revolution, I argued for the need for a fifth agricultural revolution that emphasizes soil health as the foundation for what we should view as good farming. And we have a challenge this century of trying to make more regenerative practices into the new conventional agriculture for the 21st and 22nd century and beyond. Because if we don't change the trajectory and course of agriculture, people in the future are going to have a much harder time feeding themselves than we do today.
Mm. Thank you so very much for taking the time to talk with me. I really appreciate the amount of effort that both of you expend all the time to communicate these important stories to all of us. David R. Montgomery, Anne Biklé, authors of What Your Food Ate, How to Heal Our Land and Reclaim Our Health. Thank you.
Yep, thank you.